On the night of May 12, 1940, a Dutch destroyer called the Hereward slipped out of the port of Ijmuiden into the North Sea. On board was a woman who, at that moment, controlled more territory than almost any other head of state on Earth. Her name was Queen Wilhelmina, and the empire she ruled stretched from the canals of Amsterdam to the rainforests of Suriname, from the volcanic islands of the Dutch East Indies to trading posts scattered across the Caribbean and West Africa. 60 million subjects, vast oil fields, rubber plantations, the fourth largest empire on the planet, built by a country smaller than the state of Maryland. And now, 5 days after Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands, its queen was fleeing her own capital in the dead of night, originally intending only to reach the front lines and rally her troops, but instead being persuaded, some say forced, onto a boat bound for a country that wasn't even hers. She would not set foot in the Netherlands again for 5 years, and by the time she did return, the empire she had inherited would already be dying, though she didn't know it yet. Here's the question that makes the Dutch royal story so strange, so different from every other fallen dynasty you've heard about. The House of Orange-Nassau did not fall. Not in the way the Romanovs fell, not in the way the Ottomans or the Hohenzollerns or the Habsburgs fell. There was no revolution in Amsterdam, no firing squad, no forced abdication at the barrel of a gun. The Dutch monarchy is still there today, in 2026, occupying palaces, opening parliament, cutting ribbons. King Willem-Alexander presides over an institution with roots stretching back to William the Silent in the 1500s. And yet the empire that made the Netherlands one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations in Europe, the empire that this royal family's ancestors built, expanded, and profited from for over 3 centuries, is completely gone. Vanished within the span of about 30 years. Indonesia, Suriname, the Antilles, all of it slipped away, sometimes through war, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through referendums that nobody in The Hague particularly wanted to hold. So what happened to a royal family that survived the death of its empire? What does it look like when the crown outlives the colonies, when the monarchy adapts fast enough to save itself, but not fast enough to save what it ruled? That's the story I want to tell you today, because it's less dramatic than a firing squad in a cellar, but in its own quiet way, it's just as revealing about what it takes for a dynasty to survive the modern world. To understand how the Dutch royal family ended up presiding over the wreckage of an empire, you have to go back to how strange the House of Orange-Nassau's rise to power actually was. Unlike the Habsburgs or the Ottomans, the Dutch monarchy wasn't the product of ancient conquest or divine right stretching back a millennium. It was born out of rebellion. In the late 1500s, William of Orange led a revolt of the Low Countries against the Spanish Habsburg crown, a war that would eventually produce an independent Dutch republic, one of the first modern republics in European history. For roughly 2 centuries, the Netherlands wasn't even a kingdom. It was a loose confederation of provinces, and the House of Orange held the office of stadholder, a kind of hereditary executive position, not a throne in the traditional European sense. It was during this Republican period, oddly enough, that the Dutch built the foundations of their global empire. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became the most powerful commercial enterprise the world had ever seen, controlling trade routes from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan. The Dutch West India Company followed a few decades later, extending Dutch commercial and colonial reach into the Americas and West Africa. This was, in a very real sense, a corporate empire before it was ever a royal one. It wasn't until 1815, after the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars swept across Europe, that the Congress of Vienna formally created the Kingdom of the Netherlands and installed William I, a descendant of the old House of Orange-Nassau, as its first king. The empire the Dutch had built as a republic and a trading company was now formally inherited by a crown. And that crown would spend the next century presiding over one of the most brutal and profitable colonial systems in modern history, particularly in the Dutch East Indies, the sprawling archipelago we know today as Indonesia. The Dutch East Indies were, by any measure, the crown jewel of the empire. By the early 20th century, the colony encompassed thousands of islands and roughly 70 million people, producing rubber, oil, tin, coffee, sugar, and tobacco that flowed back to Rotterdam and Amsterdam and made the Netherlands, a country of barely 8 million people at home, one of the richest nations in the world. The system that extracted this wealth, known as the cultivation system, and later its various successors, was extraordinarily exploitative, forcing Indonesian farmers to dedicate portions of their land and labor to export crops for the benefit of the Dutch treasury. Queen Wilhelmina, who ascended to the throne in 1890 at the age of 10 and would go on to reign for 58 years, the longest reign of any Dutch monarch, inherited this colonial machine and, like most European monarchs of her era, saw absolutely nothing wrong with it. She was, by most accounts, a formidable and strong-willed woman, deeply religious, fiercely protective of the House of Orange's prestige, and utterly convinced of the Netherlands' right to rule its overseas territories. Nobody in 1900, least of all Wilhelmina, imagined that within her own lifetime, this empire would begin to unravel. The unraveling started, as it so often does, with a war that had nothing to do with the colonies at all. When Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, the Dutch army, small and poorly equipped, held out for barely 5 days before the government capitulated. Wilhelmina's flight to London wasn't originally planned as a permanent exile. She had intended to travel to the southern province of Zeeland to be closer to her fighting forces, but German advances made that impossible, and British officials essentially insisted she board a destroyer for England instead. She arrived in London, according to some accounts, in a state of considerable distress, reportedly still in her nightclothes under a borrowed coat, having left the Netherlands with almost nothing. What followed were 5 years of exile that, in retrospect, may have been the single most important stretch of the entire Dutch monarchy's modern history, because it was in London that Wilhelmina transformed herself from a distant, formal monarch into a genuine symbol of national resistance. She broadcast regularly on Radio Oranje, the clandestine radio station beamed back into occupied Holland, and her voice, defiant and unyielding, became one of the few threads connecting the Dutch people to a free version of their own country. She refused to negotiate with the Germans. She publicly and repeatedly condemned the occupation and the persecution of Dutch Jews. Winston Churchill reportedly called her the only real man among the governments in exile in London, a backhanded compliment by the standards of the time, but one that reflected how seriously her steel was regarded. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, an entirely different catastrophe was unfolding for the Dutch Empire, one that would prove far more consequential for the monarchy's future than anything happening in Europe. In early 1942, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with terrifying speed, and by March of that year, the Dutch East Indies, the economic heart of the entire empire, had fallen. Dutch colonial administrators, soldiers and civilians were interned in brutal prison camps. The mythology of unshakable European colonial supremacy, the idea that had justified 3 centuries of Dutch rule in Indonesia, was shattered almost overnight. An Asian power had defeated a European one and taken its most valuable possession by force. Indonesian nationalists, who had been organizing resistance movements against Dutch rule for decades, watched all of this very closely, and some of them, most notably a charismatic engineer and orator named Sukarno, cautiously cooperated with the Japanese occupation in hopes of eventually winning independence. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Sukarno did not wait for the Dutch to return and resume their colonial administration. On August 17, 1945, just 2 days after the Japanese surrender, Sukarno stood on the veranda of his home in Jakarta and read a short, simple proclamation. Indonesia was declaring its independence. Back in the Netherlands, a country that had spent 5 brutal years under Nazi occupation, that had endured the horrific hunger winter of 1944 and 1945, in which as many as 20,000 Dutch civilians starved to death, that had lost roughly 75% of its Jewish population to the Holocaust. The response to Sukarno's declaration was almost unanimously refusal. The Dutch government and Wilhelmina herself viewed the proclamation as an illegitimate act carried out under the shadow of Japanese collaboration, and they had no intention of simply handing over their most valuable colonial possession. What followed was 5 years of increasingly desperate and increasingly brutal warfare that the Dutch, with a kind of grim euphemism that would become notorious in later decades, referred to as police actions rather than what they actually were, a colonial war. Dutch forces, many of them exhausted conscripts barely out of their teens, were shipped to Indonesia in the late 1940s to fight a guerrilla war against Indonesian nationalists. The violence was extensive and in numerous documented instances included summary executions and war crimes against Indonesian civilians, atrocities that the Dutch government would spend the better part of the next 70 years refusing to fully acknowledge. Wilhelmina, by this point in her 70s and increasingly exhausted by the physical and psychological toll of the war years, watched this second colonial war unfold with a mixture of stubbornness and, according to some of her biographers, private despair. The empire that had defined the House of Orange's global significance for 3 centuries was now being defended not with the confident authority of the 19th century, but with the desperate, dwindling resources of an exhausted post-war nation. International pressure ultimately did what Indonesian resistance alone could not fully accomplish. The United States, increasingly focused on the emerging Cold War and deeply uneasy about a prolonged, unpopular colonial conflict tying down a key European ally, threatened to cut off Marshall Plan reconstruction aid to the Netherlands unless the Dutch negotiated a genuine settlement. The United Nations Security Council, in an almost unprecedented move for the era, had already intervened diplomatically to pressure both sides toward negotiation. Faced with the choice between continuing an unwinnable war and losing the American financial support desperately needed to rebuild a country devastated by Nazi occupation, the Dutch government finally relented. On December 27, 1949, in a ceremony at the Royal Palace in Amsterdam, sovereignty over the Dutch East Indies, minus the western half of New Guinea, which the Netherlands stubbornly retained for another 13 years, was formally transferred to the new Republic of Indonesia. It is worth pausing here on one particular detail because it tells you almost everything you need to know about how this moment felt inside the House of Orange. Queen Wilhelmina, the woman who had defiantly broadcast into occupied Holland throughout the war, the woman whose voice had come to symbolize Dutch resistance and Dutch endurance, refused to personally sign the transfer document. She delegated the signing to her daughter and heir, Juliana, unable or unwilling to put her own hand to the paper that formally ended 350 years of Dutch rule over the most valuable colony any small nation had ever possessed. Wilhelmina abdicated the following year, in September of 1948, actually just before the Indonesian transfer was finalized, worn down by illness and by what many historians describe as a profound sense of exhaustion after 8 years that had encompassed both a world war and the loss of an empire. She spent her remaining years largely out of the public eye at Hetlu Palace, dying in 1962 at the age of 82. Her daughter Juliana inherited a throne that looked fundamentally different from the one Wilhelmina herself had inherited back in 1890. The Netherlands was no longer a colonial power of global significance. It was a small, recovering European nation that had just lost the territorial foundation of its wealth and prestige, and Juliana would spend the next 32 years of her reign navigating what that transformation actually meant, both for her country and for her own increasingly troubled family. Juliana's reign, in many ways, tells a very different story from her mother's. Where Wilhelmina had been rigid, formal, and forbidding, Juliana cultivated an image of relative approachability, riding a bicycle in public, sending her children to ordinary Dutch schools, rather than isolating them in palace tutoring, projecting the image of what the Dutch press affectionately and sometimes not so affectionately called a bourgeois monarchy. But beneath this more informal public image, the House of Orange was quietly grappling with 2 separate crises that, taken together, revealed just how fragile the institution's standing had become in a post-colonial, increasingly skeptical Netherlands. The first crisis involved a faith healer named Greet Hofmans, whom Juliana had brought into the royal household in the early 1950s in a desperate attempt to treat her youngest daughter Marika's near blindness, the result of a rubella infection Juliana had contracted during pregnancy. Hofmans, who practiced a kind of spiritualist faith healing entirely outside mainstream medicine, gradually gained enormous personal influence over the Queen, to the point where Juliana's husband, Prince Bernhard, and much of the Dutch political establishment grew alarmed that a faith healer with pacifist anti-establishment leanings was effectively shaping royal decision-making at the height of the Cold War. The crisis became so severe that it briefly threatened the stability of the monarchy itself, with rumors swirling that Juliana might be pressured to abdicate, and it was resolved only through direct intervention by the Dutch government, which ultimately forced Hofmanns out of the royal circle entirely in 1956. The second crisis, and by far the more damaging one, centered on Juliana's husband. Prince Bernhard was a German-born aristocrat who had, as a young man in the 1930s, been a member of both the Nazi Party and the SS Cavalry Corps, memberships he would later insist were purely nominal and professionally expedient rather than ideological, a claim that historians have treated with considerable skepticism ever since. He married Juliana in 1937, and during the German occupation of the Netherlands, redeemed himself in Dutch public opinion by serving with the Allied forces and eventually commanding Dutch forces during the liberation. For decades afterward, Bernhard cultivated an image as a dashing, internationally connected consort, sitting on the boards of major multinational corporations and helping found the World Wildlife Fund. But in 1976, that carefully constructed image collapsed. American Senate investigators, digging into the overseas bribery practices of the Lockheed Corporation, discovered that Bernhard had accepted over $1 million in bribes in exchange for influencing Dutch government purchases of Lockheed fighter jets. The scandal that followed was seismic. A special commission was convened, and though Bernhard was never criminally prosecuted, largely to spare the monarchy the trauma of a royal trial, the commission's findings were damning enough that he was forced to resign from virtually every public and military position he held, stripped of his military uniforms, and effectively banished from formal public life. For a monarchy that had already lost the empire that once justified its global relevance, the Lockheed affair was a brutal reminder of just how quickly public tolerance for royal misconduct was eroding in a country that increasingly saw itself as a modern, accountable democracy rather than a deferential kingdom. While the House of Orange was absorbing these domestic scandals, the empire's slow-motion collapse continued in the background, colony by colony. In 1962, after years of Cold War maneuvering and a brief but real military confrontation with Indonesia over the disputed territory, the Netherlands finally agreed to hand over Western New Guinea as well, transferring it first to United Nations administration, and then, following a widely criticized and heavily manipulated 1969 referendum known as the Act of Free Choice, to full Indonesian sovereignty. The Dutch Empire in Asia was now entirely gone. But there was still the Western Hemisphere to reckon with. Suriname on the northern coast of South America had been a Dutch colony since the 17th century, built on the labor of enslaved Africans, and after the abolition of slavery in 1863, indentured laborers brought from India and Indonesia. By the 1970s, facing rising nationalist sentiment and, frankly, a Dutch government in The Hague that was increasingly eager to shed the financial and moral burden of colonial administration altogether, negotiations began for Suriname's independence. On November 25, 1975, Suriname formally became an independent nation. The Dutch government, in a decision that would have enormous long-term consequences, offered Suriname's citizens a limited window to relocate to the Netherlands with full Dutch citizenship before the transition was finalized, and roughly a third of the entire Suriname's population, more than 100,000 people, chose to leave for a country many of them had never actually seen, fundamentally reshaping the demographic makeup of Dutch cities in the process. Queen Juliana, unlike her mother, did not resist this transfer of power. If anything, by the mid-1970s, the Dutch royal family and the Dutch political establishment had largely made peace with the idea that clinging to colonial possessions was no longer compatible with the country's self-image as a progressive, modern European democracy. The remaining Dutch Caribbean territories, the Netherlands Antilles and Aruba, were not granted full independence in this same wave, but their constitutional relationship with the Netherlands was repeatedly renegotiated over the following decades, with Aruba gaining a separate status within the kingdom in 1986, and the Netherlands Antilles itself formally dissolving in 2010 into several smaller constituent countries and special municipalities, an arrangement that persists in modified form to this day. Juliana abdicated in 1980 in favor of her eldest daughter Beatrix, and it's worth noting just how differently this transition unfolded compared to the abdications and depositions we've seen in other royal families across Europe. There was no exile, no confiscation of property, no ambulance racing to a waiting battleship in the dead of night. It was, on the surface, an orderly, almost bureaucratic transfer of a ceremonial office. But Beatrix's actual coronation, held on April 30th, 1980, revealed just how much anger still simmered beneath the surface of Dutch society toward the monarchy and toward the broader economic anxieties of the era. Amsterdam that day was engulfed in the worst rioting the city had seen in years, as squatters, radical leftists, and a broader coalition of protesters angry about housing shortages, unemployment, and the perceived extravagance of the monarchy clashed violently with police throughout the inauguration ceremony. The rallying cry of the protesters, Geen Woning, Geen Kroning, no house, no coronation, became one of the defining slogans of Dutch political protest in the post-war era. It was a jarring reminder that even a monarchy that had avoided revolution, that had presided over the peaceful, negotiated end of its own empire, could not simply assume the automatic goodwill of its own people. Beatrix's own marriage had already, years earlier, exposed similar fault lines in Dutch society's relationship with its royal family and with its own difficult wartime history. In 1965, Beatrix announced her engagement to Claus von Amsberg, a German diplomat who, as a teenager during the Second World War, had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and the Hitler Youth, service he had performed as a compulsory teenage draftee rather than as any kind of committed ideological Nazi, but service that, in a country still raw from 5 years of brutal German occupation and the deportation of 107,000 Dutch Jews to their deaths, was almost unbearably controversial. The announcement provoked genuine public outrage, protests, and a parliamentary debate over whether the marriage should even be permitted to proceed under the rules governing royal succession. Claus, to his considerable credit, spent decades afterward working to earn genuine Dutch public affection, largely through visible humility, self-deprecating humor, and a long, well-documented battle with depression that he discussed with unusual public candor for a royal consort. And by the time of his death in 2002, he had become one of the most beloved figures in the modern history of the House of Orange, a remarkable transformation for a man whose engagement had once triggered riot police deployment outside the royal palace. Beatrix reigned for 33 years, presiding over a Netherlands that had almost entirely completed its transition from colonial empire to small, wealthy, socially liberal European nation, one increasingly known internationally for its progressive drug policy, its early legalization of same-sex marriage, and its outsized role within the European Union rather than for any lingering imperial ambition. She abdicated in January of 2013, and her son Willem-Alexander became the first Dutch king, rather than queen, in over a century since the death of King William III back in 1990. Willem-Alexander's own marriage had, in its own way, echoed the controversies of the past. His wife, Maxima Zorreguieta, an Argentine-born banker, faced years of intense scrutiny over her father's role as a minister of agriculture in the military junta, led by Jorge Rafael Videla, the dictatorship responsible for the disappearance and murder of an estimated 30,000 Argentine citizens during the so-called Dirty War. Jorge Zorreguieta was ultimately barred from attending his own daughter's wedding, a compromise negotiated specifically to allow the marriage to proceed without further inflaming Dutch public opinion, a decision that echoed, in an odd and quieter way, the same pattern the House of Orange had navigated with Claus decades earlier. The monarchy repeatedly finding itself needing to publicly distance a beloved family member from a genuinely dark historical association in order to preserve its own legitimacy. Under Willem-Alexander, the monarchy that once presided over 60 million colonial subjects across 3 continents has settled into something considerably smaller and, by most measures, considerably more secure than it might have looked in the chaotic years immediately following the loss of Indonesia. The king draws an annual stipend from the Dutch state, reported at several million euros, considerably less extravagant than the sums involved in the British sovereign grant, and unlike Britain's monarchy, the Dutch king actually holds a modest but real constitutional role, formally appointing the government-forming negotiators after elections, though this function has itself been steadily reduced over recent decades in favor of parliamentary self-organization, part of a long, deliberate pattern of the Dutch crown voluntarily shedding whatever residual political authority it still held. The family has not been free of scandal in the 21st century. In August of 2020, at the height of the coronavirus pandemic, the royal family faced intense public criticism after flying to their vacation home in Greece, even as the Dutch government was urging citizens to avoid all non-essential travel, a trip they were ultimately forced to cut short and publicly apologize for. There has been recurring controversy over a lavish country retreat in Mozambique, nicknamed Villa Bermuda, built with funds whose origins the family has struggled to fully account for. And in 2013, Willem Alexander's younger brother, Prince Friso, died after spending over a year in a coma following a skiing accident in Austria, a tragedy that, while very different in nature from the assassinations and suicides that scarred other exiled royal families in this series, nonetheless reminded the Dutch public that even a monarchy that survived the death of its empire has not been spared its own share of private grief. So what do we actually make of the Dutch case, sitting here in 2026, when you place it alongside the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, the Pahlavis, and the British? In some ways, it is the strangest story of all of them, precisely because it lacks the dramatic climax that defines the others. There was no firing squad, there was no exile to a remote Portuguese island, there was no scattering of impoverished princes across the capitals of Europe, forced to sell their jewelry to survive. The House of Orange-Nassau simply watched its empire dissolve, colony by colony, negotiation by negotiation, over the course of roughly 3 decades, and adapted its own public identity just quickly enough to survive the transition intact. In that sense, the Dutch monarchy's survival actually resembles the British pattern far more than it resembles any of the collapses. Like the Windsors, the House of Orange had already, by the 20th century, ceded almost all of its substantive political power to an elected parliament, leaving the crown with a ceremonial and symbolic function that could survive the loss of empire without the crown itself being blamed for that loss. When Indonesia slipped away, when Suriname became independent, when the Antilles reorganized themselves, Dutch voters had an elected government to hold accountable at the ballot box. The monarchy, floating above the daily churn of politics much as the British crown does, was able to absorb the psychological shock of imperial collapse without absorbing the direct political blame for it. But there is something else at work in the Dutch story too, something a little more uncomfortable, and it's worth sitting with before we close this out. Unlike Britain, which lost an empire but retained a genuine, ongoing sense of global cultural relevance through the Commonwealth, through the English language, through the sheer scale of what it had once been, the Netherlands underwent something closer to a full identity transformation. The country that built a global trading empire on the backs of enslaved Africans, Indonesian plantation laborers, and a ruthlessly extractive colonial economic system spent the second half of the 20th century quietly, and at times almost deliberately, forgetting just how central that empire had been to its own wealth and self-conception. Dutch schoolchildren for decades learned relatively little about the violence of the so-called police actions in Indonesia. And it wasn't until 2022 that Willem Alexander himself, during a state visit to Indonesia, issued a formal apology for what he called the excessive violence of the Dutch military in that conflict, the first Dutch monarch ever to do so, 73 years after the transfer of sovereignty had actually taken place. That apology, cautious and carefully worded as it was, tells you something important about how this particular royal family survived what destroyed so many others. The House of Orange didn't defeat the forces that dismantled its empire, and it didn't heroically resist them the way Otto von Habsburg fought fascism or the way Ruprecht of Bavaria refused Hitler's overtures. It simply let go, quietly, repeatedly, colony after colony, controversy after controversy, and it kept letting go for so long and so consistently that by the time the public fully reckoned with what had been lost and with the human cost of how it had been held onto for as long as it was, the monarchy itself was no longer standing at the center of that reckoning. The empire took the blame. The crown, mostly, did not. Maybe that's the real lesson buried inside this particular royal story. Stranger and quieter than the tragedies of the Romanovs or the Pahlavis, but no less revealing. Power doesn't always end in a single dramatic collapse. Sometimes it simply drains away, year after year, treaty after treaty, until the family that once ruled 60 million people across 3 continents is left presiding over a small, wealthy, thoroughly modern European nation that would rather talk about bicycle lanes and social housing than about the empire its ancestors built. The House of Orange-Nassau lost almost everything that once made it globally significant, and in exchange, it got to keep the one thing so many other dynasties in this series never managed to hold on to. It got to stay home. If you found this story interesting, do the channel a favor and leave a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button. There are a lot more of these fallen empire stories coming, and I'd love to have you along for the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.